1 Samuel 30 and chapter 31. David and his men have just left Aphek after being told that they cannot fight in the battle that is about to take place in Jezreel between Saul's army and the Philistines. So they reach Ziklag on the third day, which is a distance of about 50 or so miles, and they find that the Amalekites have made a raid on the Negev and Ziklag. The towns had been burned, all the women, all the children, all the men who had been left were taken captive. And of course, this also includes David's two wives. And the people wanted to put David to death by stoning him as a result because of the loss of their families. So David strengthens himself in the Lord. He asks for the priest Abiathar to bring the ephod, and David asks God, "Shall I pursue this band of Philistines? Shall I overtake them?" And the answer was a resounding yes. So David takes 600 of his men, and when they reach the brook of Bezor, 200 of his men just cannot continue because they're so tired and worn out. The other 400 continue on their way, and as they're traveling to find the band that has taken away all these people and all their possessions, they find this Egyptian man who basically had been left for dead. He had not eaten for 3 days or 3 nights. They feed him, he's revived, and he is able to tell them that he is a servant of an Amalekite, and David asks him if he'll take them to this band of people, this band of Amalekites. He agrees to on the condition that David will not kill him and that David will not return him to his master. David and his men overtake the Amalekites. They destroy them except for 400 young Amalekites that escape on camels. So David recovers all that the Amalekites had taken, and he rescues everyone. And of course, since he destroys the Amalekites except for those 400, he also takes the spoil that was left as a result. So David and his men and all the people return to the brook of Bezor. The men who had been left come out to greet David, but some of the men that had gone with David were not willing or did not want to share the spoil with these 200 men. David reminds them that the victory was God's victory, and that because of God's guidance, because of God's care, they had won the battle and that they needed to share the spoil. When they get back to Ziklag, David sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, and he sends spoil to his friends that are scattered throughout, people who had helped to protect him from Saul over all these years. In fact, there were some 13 different cities scattered throughout the area which David sent the spoil to. Chapter 31, we find that Saul and his men are fighting the Philistines, and the men of Israel end up fleeing, and many were killed on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtake Saul and his sons and kill 3 of Saul's sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. An arrow hits Saul. He's badly wounded. Saul wants his armor bearer to kill him so that the Philistines cannot say that they killed Saul, but the armor bearer refuses, so Saul falls on his own sword, and the armor bearer does the same. The people who lived on the other side of the Jordan flee when they find out that the Israelites have been basically defeated, and so the Philistines come and live in those cities. Well, the next day the Philistines find Saul, they cut his head off, they strip him of his weapons, they carried the weapons to the temple of one of their false gods, the Ashtaroth, and they actually take David's sons' bodies and Saul's son's body and Saul's body, and they actually attach them to the wall at Bethshan. When some of the valiant men from Israel find out, they go at night and they take the bodies of Saul and Saul's 3 sons. They take them from the wall and they come to Jabesh and they burn them, and then they take their bones and they bury them under a tree in Jabesh, and they fast for 7 days. There are a lot of different lessons that we can learn from these 2 chapters. You can focus on tragedy and how it often causes people to turn to God or away from God. You can ask the question, how do you respond to loss? Imagine losing everything that you have. David is the first to turn to the Lord and it hasn't been since chapter 23 that David has sought God by means of the ephod, and it hasn't been since chapter 26 that he mentions the name of the Lord. So you can talk about how David responds. It tells us that he strengthens himself in the Lord. Or talk about how we go about strengthening ourselves in the Lord. David obviously strengthened himself by reflecting on, first of all, the rejection of the Philistine leaders when they would not let him go with them to fight against Saul. David can reflect now and see God's hand in all that, and why God did not allow him to go up and fight. David would have possibly had to kill some of his own family, some of his own loved ones, if God had allowed him to go up and fight. He would also have been away from his family, no telling how long, and no telling what would have happened to David's family had he not come back to Ziklag and found the city burned and all his family taken away. David could reflect upon God's calling, how God had anointed him, and so David has a destiny to fulfill. He could remember again how God had delivered him in the past, numerous times when Saul could have killed him and Saul was not able to. And David could take encouragement from the Lord. You can look at 1 Chronicles 12, 19 and 20. We often are the reason for our own mess. We get ourselves into situations and then we later realize that. 1 Samuel 27, verse 2. If you go back to that, you see the reason that David is in this mess, because he decided to go and live among the Philistines. So we are often humbled and realize that we cause our own problems. You can even talk about the prodigal son and how this incident in certain situations really mirrors that, how David returns to God. So no matter how low we get, we can find our way back to God. That way is always open. David realizes his failures, much like the prodigal son realizes his, and returns to God for help. You can talk about the fact that David did what God told him to do. The fact that David showed care and kindness to others. David saw it as the Lord's victory. David shared the rewards with others. David sent requests or rewards to others as a way of strengthening bonds and mending relationships. David is a picture of Jesus when he gives spoil away. When Jesus triumphed over death on the cross, he won the greatest battle, and he had spoil to share. He shared the spoil with his people, Ephesians 4, verses 7 to 8. which talks about giving each of us grace. And when he ascended on high, uh, he gave gifts to us. He gave us the gift of eternal life. We are like David's men. We have been given spoil. We have been given eternal life. We are like the Egyptian slave. We were left for dead. God sent his son to suffer and die that we could be revived and have hope of eternal salvation. We are like the spoil that has been recovered. Thanks to Jesus, we've been recovered. We've been redeemed. You can also look at 1 Chronicles 10, verses 1 through 14. I hope this helps you in preparation for this outstanding lesson from 1 Samuel 30 and chapters 31.